Welcome on the Gospel Spice podcast, where you are invited to taste and see that the Lord is good. Gospel Spice is your Christ-centered podcast infused with in-depth biblical flavors and sprinkled with a dash of French culture, guaranteed to spice up your relationship with God. I'm your host, Stephanie Roussel, and here is today's episode. Os Guinness, welcome back on Gospel Spice.
Thank you. It's a great privilege to be with you again.
It's your third time with us. It has become a bit of a tradition. I love it. So whenever you have a new book, you need to come and tell us about it. We have a deal?
Happy to.
So you actually do have a new book out, but more than that, we're going to talk about 50 years of writing. There's no way you've been writing for 50 years, but we're going to talk about that. So how does it feel to be in 2023 and celebrating this big milestone with a new book, Signals of Transcendence?
Well, I'm very happy to get that one out because it goes with the other one that we discussed the last time I was with you.
Yes, the Great Quest we discussed just about a year ago. It was Easter. So Signals of Transcendence was on the heels of it. You mentioned, I think you were writing Signals of Transcendence as we were discussing the Great Quest. Or it was, you were almost done with it because you had whetted my appetite with it. So tell us more about it.
Well, they're both written for people who are searchers or seekers. We hear a lot about people becoming religious nuns and leaving the church and the faith. But in fact, in my experience in universities and ordinary life, there's a terrific search for meaning and belonging. So these two books are written for people who are seekers. In other words, it's not written for my fellow Christians, it's written for seekers. And the second one is simply stories. In other words, not even arguments. It's simply 10 stories of people who had this extraordinary experience, which my mentor, Peter Berger, calls signals of transcendence. In other words, people experience something incredibly profound for them. But the effect is to puncture what they used to believe and point to something else which, if it were true, would make all the difference. And so they become seekers, not believers, but seekers. They set out on the search. So that's what this book's about. 10 very different people, but all experiencing something that made them think more deeply, care more deeply, and start to search.
So can you unpack for us what this expression, signals of transcendence, really means?
Well, I just described it like that.
Yeah, but give us maybe yours. Have you had a signal of transcendence in your own life?
Well, let me just take some of the stories themselves because they speak for themselves. Maybe my favorite in the book, although everyone's struck by a different story, is W.H. Auden. He was a young, left-wing, gay atheist before World War II. He fought on the Republican side in the Spanish Civil War. And when he came over to the US to escape the looming war, he was a champion of sort of young left-wing gays. Now, in those days, no television, of course, 1939. So if you wanted to follow what was happening in Europe, you went to the local cinema to watch the documentary news. And he went to his cinema on the Upper East Side of New York, Yorkville, and unbeknownst to him, they were largely a German audience. And to be fair, of course, America was neutral. So it was Britain against Germany, and America was neutral. Of course, he was English. But the documentary one weekend was on the siege of Poland. And Nazi stormtroopers were bayoneting women and children. And the German crowd were egging on their own fellow Germans. They shouted out in the darkness, "Kill them, kill them." Auden was horrified. Horrified. He said this was evil. I'd always thought humans were basically good. A little better politics, better psychology, more education, and the goodness would break through. No, this was evil. But then he said, I had to have an absolute judgment to say that it was absolutely evil, not relatively. But he says, as a young intellectual, there were no absolutes. That was crazy. So he says, I left the cinema a seeker after an unconditional absolute and met Jesus. In other words, his intuitive desire, absolutely sure there had to be an absolute to say it was wrong. And that punctured his atheistic views and set him out, and he became a believer.
So after he came to faith, he was able to look back and see how that moment in time had been that that click that allowed him to enter into the search. And that's what you described. I love how you end each chapter the same way. Do you want to tell us how you end each chapter and how it connects all the dots slowly but surely towards the end?
Well, I try and show how each signal made a huge difference to that particular person, but not every single appeals to everyone. And so people have got to listen to them. You know, a friend of mine, one of the later stories of Kenneth Clark, the great art historian, a friend of mine, Kenneth Clark describes he's in Florence and the sheer beauty of the painting. He said, I felt the finger of God. But then I brushed it off. People would think I was mad, etc. And then that story, more than I've just described, a friend of mine did that, read it out with some CEOs, about 30 of them. Every single one of them said they had an experience like that in their life. In other words, the fact is, we're living in what Plato called the cave.
Mm-hmm.
You know, Plato said his prisoners were in the cave, and their view of reality was the flickering shadows on the wall. So if you escaped the cave, the people inside the cave would think you were a madman. But the person who escaped has seen the sun. And in a way, our modern world, my mentor Peter Berger calls it a world without windows. What's real to people today? What you can touch, taste, see, calculate, measure, weigh. The world of science, technology, business, politics. What's unseen to modern people is unreal. Now, that's crazy. Plato and most people in history, certainly most people today in Africa, Asia, many parts of Latin America, the unseen is not unreal. In fact, it's more real than the seen world. So our modern world, we're like prisoners in the cave, and we need to have a grand breakout. And I'm hoping my book to individuals will make people see they need to break out of this modern consciousness, which only sees what's right in front of their noses. There's a far deeper reality.
Yes, especially in our air-conditioned caves nowadays, and so comfortable that it's even harder to want to get out of it because everything is created so that we would be very comfortable and forgetful inside of those caves.
Right.
So, you know, I've read Signals of Transcendence a couple of times. The first time to get the scope of it, and the second time to go a little bit deeper into the stories. And then I was wondering, how many of the people you're talking about have you actually met or had some, I mean, obviously Peter Berger, but like others who were, I mean, because they all are mostly from the 20th century, mostly. So what's your personal experience of them?
Well, Malcolm Muggeridge, the first one I
Mm-hmm.
talked about, I knew him when he was the age I am now, and I was a student. Obviously, I knew Peter Berger. He was my
Mm-hmm.
mentor and tutor when I did my doctorate. And then, of course, one whom you know,
Yeah.
one of the
Mm-hmm.
stories is about my dear wife. So I know her
Mm-hmm.
very well. And she's certainly 21st century. And
Yes. Mm-hmm.
last one, I brought in my grandparents. I didn't know my grandfather, but I knew my grandmother.
Yes, I found that story about your grandmother, Jane, very touching, and your grandfather, because it tied back into your own story that you've shared bits and pieces of with us and, you know, in many different settings. Do you want to take us? I would love for you to share the story of your grandfather with Phil Guinness and his wife, because it's the story of love. And you were just mentioning your wife. So it all ties back into love and family.
Well, I put it in because when we were looking through her stuff, we came across a wonderful little handwritten note. And it was the note that my grandfather had given my grandmother. Of course, they were in their 20s then when they were married, the first Christmas of their lives together. And he'd written, if I remember rightly, to one who is dearer than life, with a love that is stronger than death. Now, whether that was original to him or he was quoting someone, I don't know. But it spoke to me of love as a signal of transcendence. Now, in the modern world, we've cheapened love, say the hookup culture, and we've cheapened it with things like Hallmark cards and all the emojis and so on. But if you look at love at its most passionate, you take the song, "If love is not forever, what's forever for?" Love is an incredible signal of transcendence. You're not just satisfied with a moment. Something far deeper, hinting, pointing, is in play. And that's what I love in that particular story.
Mm-hmm. And they, your grandparents met as believers, and they created this legacy of love that they're the parents to your father, and then obviously to you indirectly. So, by the way, you mentioned in the book that you had that note on your desk for a long time. Is it still around?
It's in my study, but it's not on my desk.
That's yeah, I love that. I don't have the privilege of having beautiful little items from history from my family, so I really appreciated that story. Do you want to share a little bit more about how, well, I think what I'm trying to ask is, how is love a particularly potent signal that is so countercultural today? And you've touched on that, but more specifically, how is love, why has it been, what does it have to do with Plato's cave? I think what I'm trying to ask is, how is love maybe one of the most powerful ways to want to get out of the cave?
Well, if you just take modern love,
Mm-hmm.
you take the hookup culture at its cheapest, it's just two bodies having temporary pleasure and so on. But someone in love knows that's hardly the beginning of things.
Mm-hmm.
The idea of sleeping with someone and then leaving the next night, never seeing them again, is ridiculous.
Mm-hmm.
When you love something, everything in you desires something more. Now, what is that something more? And more importantly, what fulfills that something more? If you look at the atheist view, finally, we all come from chance and determinism. That doesn't help. The same is true if you look at the Hindu and Buddhist view. But in the Jewish and Christian view, God, a transcendent God outside our universe, is love. And so the love we feel is grounded and fulfilled in knowing him. And you get a completely different answer. But of course, someone who has that signal of transcendence has got to do the searching so that when they come to know God, it's a fully rational, responsible step and not just a leap in the dark.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. It's interesting because I was literally just last night, my husband and I were discussing with a group of college students about our own personal story. And my husband was sharing how maybe what he might term his signal of transcendence had to do with the understanding coming from a Muslim background of the notion of what you just said, God is love. And because in Islam, God might perform acts of love, but that is not a primary attribute. It's something he may choose to do in his capriciousness, but that is not something he is. Whereas, you know, for him to, for Jonah to understand that love was God's primary attribute in the Christian faith was maybe his own signal of transcendence alongside the exclusivity of the claims of Christ, which may or not touch us depending on where we are. So all I'm trying to say is those signals of transcendence vary from person to person. And you didn't in the book include yours. So I just shared my husband's. Do you have a signal of transcendence specifically for you?
I don't think I did. In other words, not everyone does.
Mm-hmm.
And it's particularly happens to people who are in some dogmatic belief, such as atheism. I mean, C.S. Lewis is a good example. I mean, he was a hardcore atheist. He knew many atheists. He'd thought through the arguments. And yet he had what he called, he was surprised by joy. Experiences, it wasn't pleasure, that's the five senses. It wasn't happiness, that's circumstances. It was joy. Now, he couldn't understand that. He couldn't explain and interpret it as an atheist. Now, his search took more than a dozen years until he found.
Mm-hmm.
but it was being surprised by joy as a stubborn, hard-boiled atheist that got him searching.
Mhm.
In my case, I thought through and came to my own faith when I was a teenager. And I read a lot. On the one hand, reading people like Nietzsche and Sartre and Camus on the atheist side, because I had brought up in the East. I knew I wasn't terribly interested in Hinduism, Buddhism. It was secularism or the Christian faith for me. But it was a 2-year search, reading, talking to people, and so on. But I wasn't a hard boiled anything, so that I didn't need that signal of transcendence to puncture what I believed.
Mhm, mhm. God will meet us where we are in his kindness, and he will give us exactly what we need. As you say, let those who have ears hear what he's saying. We mentioned your dear wife very briefly. Do you want to share briefly her signal of transcendence? Because it ties back to love indirectly with you.
Well, her story, and she's writing it now, it's almost finished, is far more wonderful than I can get in a minute or two. But I'll just mention the final turning point. I mean, she grew up a broken home in California. She'd been made a ward of court and had been put in a Dickensian delinquent home for children. It was brutal. So she had incredible questions. Although she came out of that, went to USC. On a whim, she started to do some fashion modeling, and to a surprise, rocketed from San Francisco to Toronto to Paris to New York, and found herself in the late 60s on the front cover of Vogue 4 times. And she was engaged to a young, handsome French baron
Who's
from
French?
your wonderful country.
Mhm.
Same age, but a multimillionaire. The world was her oyster. And she had, of course, no faith out of this broken background where her mother followed a guru and her father was an atheist. But one weekend, and they went to Paris every weekend, and his friends were people like the Duke and Duchess of Windsor and Salvador Dali, Pablo Picasso. One weekend, they were at a party in the Hotel Meurice in Paris in the apartment of the artist Salvador Dali, the great surrealist. And in the center of this incredible, illustrious list of people, titles and so on, all incredible dress, in the center was Dali's painted leopard, a cheetah. And Jenny was looking at this beautiful, lithe jungle animal, declawed, defanged, desexed, de-everythinged. And she suddenly thought, it's a gross caricature of whatever it was born to be. And so are we. And it was suddenly as if the whole room opened up with an abyss of absolute meaninglessness. And she said to her fiance, we got to look for the meaning of life. Is there a God? He said, okay, let's do that when we get back to New York. And she was sent by people in New York who didn't know any better to mediums and all sorts of dreadful answers. So for 2 years, she got nowhere. But she had become a searcher. And the turning point came for her after that turning point when she was walking up Park Avenue one night and she said, God, if you're there, I can't find you. Please, will you find me? And he did. But it was that experience of Dali's cheetah that was the turning point for her.
Mm-hmm. I love that she told God, find me because I don't know how to find you. You know, in your words, you said it better. But I think that is so encouraging because that's a prayer as a Christian that I pray for my family members who don't know God at all to this day. Lord, they don't know what they're doing. Please find them because they don't even know how to find you. I don't even know that they're interested in that. So the authenticity of her quest was exactly what was honored. Sorry. I'm sorry about that. You actually tie back a lot of the stories to the Great Quest, because what you're describing in the Great Quest is, well, I'd like you to say, like, what's the link between the two books and how are these complementary tools for the seeker and for the believer who wants to give them away to non-believers?
Well, the Great Quest is different. It's a description of the journey towards faith and the different phases that a seeker or a searcher will go through. And phase one is a time for questions.
Mhm.
People become seekers when they have a question that bugs them so much they need to find an answer. Up till then, they're satisfied. But when someone has a question, whatever they believed before doesn't satisfy, and they set out to search for something better. Now, the whole of the signals of transcendence is really the way that life and the Lord prompts
Mhm.
people to see the questions that are raised to them, and they become seekers. But The Great Quest is a much more comprehensive book, and it's my personal description of how people can think it through. Whereas the great thing about Signals, it's simply 10 stories of real people who had the real experience and then became seekers.
I honestly think that Signals of Transcendence is such a unique book. I've never read anything like it, and I really believe that it's so simple, maybe not simple, but it's pretty short. And it's honestly, I love how you wrote it so simply. It's for people like me, for regular people, to give away to other regular people, and actually to read for ourselves, because I don't know if you've heard that from other readers, but as I was reading it, it was making me become aware of maybe not signals of transcendence for me, but important steps in my own journey. And made me think of my husband's. And um, in that sense, I think it's a very useful
Mm.
book, or inquisitive book, for Christians to read, because it makes us aware of our own journey a little bit more, and therefore it helps me articulate my own journey for other non-believers as well. So
Mhm.
it actually is a very powerful form of apologetics, wouldn't you say? Storytelling.
I hope so. In other words, most Christian books are arguments.
Mm-hmm.
Arguments for the resurrection, arguments for this, that, or the other. And that's incredibly important. There's no argument here at all, really. You just have 10 stories of people who are triggered to search like this. And I hope it will prompt people to see in their own lives there are things that are making them think.
Mm-hmm. You end with an 11th story. Probably what you say might have been the greatest signal ever. Do you want to tell us about the final hero in your stories?
Well, I just put it in as, to me, it's the greatest signal ever. But the person never became a seeker because the signal was so powerful that seconds later he met the Lord himself. And that's the story of the burning bush. Obviously, if you think of life, change and cessation and destruction and entropy and the so-called second law of thermodynamics is written into life. And Moses sees a bush burning. Well, that wasn't unusual. Burning, but not burned up. What on earth could make it so that a fire, which always reduces things to ashes, in this case is burning brightly but never burned up? Something far more incredible was at stake, something self-existent. And as he turns aside to see it, you see he shifts from it captures his attention to it demands his explanation. And then he hears the voice of the Lord calling him. It's a very unusual signal. He's not a classic seeker like the others because he finds so fast. But to me, it's the most extraordinary story.
Mm-hmm. Well, and you have a personal passion for Moses' role and how he was so, obviously with the Exodus and so many of your other books on that. So it made me smile to see you connecting the dots that way, of how your own passion for what Moses did through the Exodus and how God used him, you're tying it back to that moment. And again, it made me ask myself how God works through our own personal stories and how we can share them in just really the most powerful form of apologetics. I wonder how he told that story. Have you ever, yeah, what do you think? How do you think Moses recounted that moment to his people?
I have no idea. In
I
other
mean,
words,
he told us,
the whole of
he
the
eventually told us. So,
again and again, Moses must have told someone, but I don't think Moses wrote it all down because we have at the end of Deuteronomy the account of his
34.
own
Mm-hmm.
death, which he
Mm-hmm.
couldn't have written. So I don't know, and the Jews don't know. But I love that story because Exodus is the master story of human freedom. And you don't understand freedom unless you understand the Exodus and all that it's meant. And so, of course, it all starts with the call of Moses.
Yes. Just a quick little interruption in that, speaking of your books on the Exodus and all of your many books, because it's the 50th anniversary of your first book, IVPress and Gospel Spice are giving away your entire bibliography published by IVP. So it's 12 titles, unless I'm mistaken. It's for one person who is watching us or listening to us. So you need to go to gospelspice.com/giveaway to enter for a chance to win all of Oz's books. And there's some Gospel Spice merch in there as well. So that's a gift to celebrate your 50th anniversary, including all the books about the Exodus and Moses that are honestly really inspiring. Your take on the Exodus is unlike any other I've ever read, even though I've only read a tiny portion of what's available, obviously.
And now, a brief message from Gospel Spice.
Have you ever experienced a measure of staleness in your relationship with God? Have you ever wondered if there could be more to the Christian life than what you've experienced so far? If so, we invite you to join us here at Gospel Spice. My name is Stephanie Roussel, and I'm delighted to welcome you. Gospel Spice exists to inspire our generation to delight in God. We provide resources to empower Christian leaders across generational, social, ethnic, and geographical boundaries towards more intimacy with Jesus Christ and discipleship effectiveness through a biblical, Christocentric foundation. We provide a safe environment for spiritual and community growth, and we aim to empower people to know Christ more intimately, serve one another more powerfully, and reach the world for Jesus. We invite you to taste and see.
Now, back to the video.
All right, Oz, 50 years of writing. How's that even possible? How does that feel?
Well, I never set out to be a writer as the last thing in my mind. I was originally planning to be a diplomat in the British Foreign Office. But, in 1968, I think I've told you this before, I came over here for 6 weeks and had such an incredible experience of that crucial year in the counterculture with Martin Luther King's assassination, Senator Kennedy's assassination, and so on. I went back to Europe and just informally gave some simple talks. 1, 2, 3, 4. And people came up and said, "This is interesting. You should write it." Write it? Not that crazy. I just brushed them off. And then my old English teacher from school in England heard me and he said, "You should write it." Again, I said, "Come on." And I thought, well, why not? And I actually wrote down the outline of them, 10 chapters, and thought, I'll have a go. So I was only in my late 20s when I wrote to the first, never intended to be a writer. And then after the first one, the second one came easily, and then the third and the fourth, and so on. I fell into it accidentally.
So as you look back, maybe not with your first book, as you said, it was kind of accidental, but as it became maybe more part of who you were, where did you think it was going to take you in terms of, because in terms of the influence you were going to have on the people who were going to read versus, where you thought it was going to go versus where now looking back, you've seen it gone?
Well, my idea was always, I've always been moved by the verses in the Bible about the signs of the times and generation and day and hour and moment. Our Lord's weeping over Jerusalem because, quote, they missed God's moment when it came, or the men of David in Chronicles who were skilled in reading the signs of the times. So the common thread in all my books is, where are we? And what does that mean? So the books that are more Christian, what does that mean for Christian disciples? And so on. So that's my burning sense. Where are we? And what does this mean for how we're to live?
And so 50 years of writing, do you feel like things have changed around us just a tad, maybe?
Well,
so, 50 years ago today, where are we?
America is unrecognizable. compared with what it was in 1968. So what was then the counterculture, and people thought by the early 70s it had failed, now in its development in what's called the woke culture, cultural Marxism, has really swept many of the elite institutions of America. The American Republic, I think, has foundered. American democracy is being called into question. America, in many, many ways, is unrecognizable from the country I first visited in 1968.
Mm-hmm. How about Europe?
Well, some of these ideas had happened much earlier in Europe. So ever since the 18th century and the French Revolution, as you know well, ever since then, some of these ideas have crept in profoundly in Europe. So in Europe, they predominated, but America was different. You could take things, great differences like the First Amendment. In Europe, secularism was partly a revulsion against corrupt, oppressive state churches, like yours in France before the revolution. America never had that. The genius of the First Amendment, religion was disestablished and flourished not despite it, but because of it. It was all based on voluntary agreement. But even that is going now, and you can see that the basic rights, freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, are all under threat from the woke culture.
And as a Christian, you know, most of our audience are American Christians. What would you say that as we look at the culture today, maybe in America specifically, maybe in the West in general, what's noise versus what's actually concerning? What would you what are you seeing that people might get riled up about that you're like, yeah, that's just noise, it doesn't really matter, versus what actually really matters? Could you name maybe some of those?
Well, the way I'd put it is this: too many Americans are caught up in trench warfare. I went to a dinner on Capitol Hill last summer with some incredibly distinguished people whose names you'd all know. But I said to my wife at the end, it was all trench warfare. There was no statesmanship. Our English word strategic comes from the French word, the Greek word for general. The strategist is the general who sees the whole of the battlefield, like a Churchill in my younger days, or earlier like an Abraham Lincoln. And America needs an Abraham Lincoln, and Christians need to look at the whole picture before they decide which things they're going to stand for, which things they're going to oppose. There's far too much, they're doing this, we'll fight them here, here's a fire, put that one out, and so on. There's no general statesman-like vision of the field. We need Lincolns today.
So that's for society in general. What about in the church? Any thoughts on what's noise and what's the crucial red flags you're seeing?
Well, sadly, what we need most in the church is an awakening. In other words, the American church, the scandal of the church in Europe, as you know, in France or Britain, Germany, Christians are a tiny minority. They've lost their standing. America is the last big country in the Western world where Christians are a huge majority and yet uninfluential. So our Jewish friends, they're tiny, but they punch so far above their weight intellectually, culturally, financially. They have incredible influence, all power to them. Whereas we, who are the biggest majority in the country still, are uninfluential, and yet Jesus called us to be salt and light. So we are the problem. Now, the reason is, in many ways, we've become more American than Christian. And so we need a reformation, a revival. So thank God for all that we've heard happening at Asbury in the last month. But that's local. We need to ask the Lord to pour out his Spirit on the whole nation. Actually, we need it the whole of the Western world, but something far bigger. You know, the first awakening touched the whole of American culture and the English-speaking world. The second awakening, which led to things like the abolition of slavery, again, was immensely powerful throughout the English-speaking world and wider. So we mustn't just be content with little local revivals. We need a massive outpouring of the Lord, and we can only ask him for that through his mercy in prayer.
Mhm, mhm. Okay, something maybe encouraging about the state of the church today.
Well, what I say often is the generalizations about America or the church are rather discouraging, the polls and so on. But the exceptions are wonderfully inspiring, and that's what counts. So, in area after area, there are good things happening at the moment. They're the exceptions. They're minorities. They're people standing against the tide, but they're making a difference. I take, say, sex trafficking, which has become a huge Christian concern, rightly. IJM, International Justice Mission, started in our church in Washington and has grown incredibly strong and powerful. It's just one example. But thank God for all the exceptions. And we should each make sure that we are part of the exception and not part of the general mass that's too worldly.
Yeah, because I was going to ask you exactly that. What does it look like for each one of us to be a part of actively praying for the awakening, the revival, but also still doing all the things that need to be done until that happens?
Well, I mentioned Lincoln. And the trouble with mentioning Lincoln or Churchill or anyone is that people think the leadership is the person up the top or out in front. The president or the CEO or the general. No. The biblical idea of leader is everyone in their own sphere, at their own level, taking the initiative and taking the responsibility for doing what needs to be done. So I may have told you before, I love the Jewish notion. There's a gentleman in the Old Testament, you hardly notice his name, Nahshon. He is, I remember, is Aaron's son-in-law. But he's famous in the Jewish tradition as the man who entered the Red Sea when no one else would. So Moses lifts the rod up. The Lord sends the wind and drives back the waves. But everyone looked at it and said, after you. But Nahshon strode out, and the Jews said the water actually came up to his neck before it started to subside. But he took the initiative, and everyone followed him happily in. And we need people in every sphere, every level. In other words, starting in our families, in our neighborhoods, in our workplaces. That's where most of us are every day. And that's where we've got to be the leaders for Jesus today.
Mm-hmm. We can't wait for the big things to drop on our lap. We have to do the daily things. I remember how your wife was just so sweet not so long ago, just noticing a homeless man down the street and how she just reached out and wanted to help him. And I've heard that has progressed quite a bit in a good way. But that's exactly what we're called to do, right? Not wait for the big things, but do the little things in front of us.
That's right.
And how, and honestly, I think the again, Signals of Transcendence is probably one of the most practical books to do just that, because when you read those stories, it makes you want to share them. And as you do that, that brings me to, so by the way, is that okay if I share that, if I leave that story in about Jenny, or would you rather I removed it?
Oh, no, it's fine.
Is that okay? Okay, just making sure that can get removed. What happens when you do the right thing after the right thing, when they're little things? What it does is that it builds truly a legacy. And again, as I'm looking back over 50 years of you building a legacy, and it sounds like you didn't know that's what you were setting out to do. What parts of the last 50 years are you most joyful to have been a part of?
I avoid the word legacy totally.
Okay. All right.
With the secular world, there's a lot of talk in the business community about legacy. In other words, it's a kind of immortality project for people who don't know the Lord.
Okay.
I think as Christians, we don't know the legacy. The real legacy is the day we meet the one who called us face to face and he says, well done, Stephanie, Eunice, or whatever. That's legacy. And we have no idea what we've done. So you mentioned little things. My parents were and my grandparents were in the China Inland Mission as Hudson Taylor founded it. He was very famous for a wonderful little saying, a little thing is a little thing, but faithfulness in a little thing is a big thing. So we often think, well, we're doing nothing unless we've done something spectacular. Not at all. It's the sum total of faithfulness in a million little things that adds up to the big thing. But we have no idea what our legacy is. You may have helped someone. I mean, who knows? That man that Jenny helped, she doesn't know where he is today. We don't know where the things we've done have led to, but one day we will. So we can never decide we're a success or a failure. No, there may be people in this world that other people look at as a dead loss or a failure. They haven't done very much. And yet when we get to the kingdom of heaven, maybe some woman's praying in Louisiana was more important in America than Billy Graham's preaching, and so on. We don't know. So for myself, you go any way you like. I avoid all the discussion of legacy. We simply don't know, and we only really know when we meet the Lord face to face.
Mm-hmm. Point well taken, and I really appreciate that. Let me rephrase that just a bit, because I'm French and I'm stubborn. Maybe not. So here's as you were saying, I completely agree with you, of course, and I stand corrected.
Not
but
you.
No, but okay, let me take you to the French for legacy. It's closer maybe to the word, what's the word picture I could use? When a father builds his estate to then leave it to his children, that idea of a legacy, of what you're building towards, maybe more the inheritance. And in that sense, what are you, again, I want to use the word joyful. What are you most joyful that God has partnered with you to build when you look back? And it doesn't have to be a big thing, but what are you most joyful about?
Well, probably the book, since you're putting it that way. The book of mine that's given me the most sense of that is The Call. And hardly a week goes by when one or two people come up and say that book made all the difference in my life. Now, I'm hoping these two books this year people will say, those are the books that nudged me towards thinking, and I came to faith. I may never know that. So I'm very grateful for that. But when you come to money, say inheritance, you can count it. Some of my ancestors, I'm part of the poor end of the Guinness family, but some of my ancestors left a fortune to their children. You could quantify that, so many hundreds of millions. But that's not a Christian view of legacy. What you've done by winning someone to Christ or helping a daughter or a son grow in the faith, it's not quantifiable in numbers. Our world is obsessed with numbers, and the Bible is much more realistic. So the fruit of the Spirit, you can never quantify. So I think the deepest things we do are beyond any number and probably beyond any report that anyone could ever tell us. They're things we'll never know.
I have come to think, and again, I'd love your opinion on that. Pondering a life well lived, and again, the importance of how we honor the Lord and how we just make him really our delight. I've come to think that for me, the true definition of a true legacy or a true, a successful life is when I measure my days by the delight I take in the Lord. And if today is a day where I delight in him and where I make him the center, then this was a good day. And therefore the succession of good days leads to a successful life in terms of, worshiping him and glorifying him and making him the center, even though it probably is, even Jesus, most of the things he did outside of the big miracles and stuff were probably pretty mundane, and they probably didn't make it in the pages of scripture because they weren't worth relating, but they may have been very important too.
But if that's what you're saying legacy is, then only one person in the world, apart from the Lord, knows it. That's you. Even Eunice,
on a good day, yeah.
Even Eunice wouldn't know which days you've made your delight in the Lord. I wouldn't know. Your friends wouldn't know. That's fair enough. That's
right, because at the end of right, because it's not, and I don't think it's even right, because truly, I mean, the idea of legacy, like you said, I agree, we can't measure that, but we can measure whether we've over time, whether we've grown in our enjoyment of the Lord and in our intentionality about it, because it's very active. I mean, taking delight in the Lord you don't just sit there and wait for it to happen. You're very intentional about it. And that's why earlier I was using the word joyful with you, because there's a joyfulness to that. And obviously joy, C.S. Lewis, I would never, ever put myself in the same category as C.S. Lewis in any way, shape, or form. However, when he says he's the most reluctant convert in all of England, that's exactly how I felt when I came to faith in the States. I felt like I was the most reluctant convert in all of France. And the role of joy, I think, is such a powerful magnet to draw us to the Lord. So
Did you enjoy my story from France of the?
I did, yes. Tell us more about it. Oh, I did. I actually, I did not know about it. So I had to look it up. I had to research it because you were the first one to tell me about it, I have to admit. So tell us. That is such a delightful story. Well, it's a very hard story. It's a very, very difficult story, but it's very beautiful.
Ending. Yeah. No, Philip Halley was Jewish, born in Chicago, grew up with violence, and then drafted in the World War II in the army. And he saw a lot of the horrific Nazi brutality, and then became a scholar of the horror of the Nazi treatment of children and so on, the surgical operations without anesthetics. So his life was just obsessed with this, and he got gloomier and gloomier and considering suicide. To cut a long story short, one day he went down to his study thinking black, pessimistic thoughts, looked at all his books on this library of horror. He said, well, here's one I haven't looked at. He picked up a little pamphlet, and it was the story of Le Chambon in France, where the Huguenots, the Protestant Christians who'd been persecuted for 300 years, sheltered 5,000 Jewish children. And as he read this, he thought it was a fly in his eye. And he put his finger up, it was a tear. His heart had grown so hard through all this evil, he couldn't cry. But he said what turned him round was the heart-cracking goodness of those wonderful French Huguenots. And I love that. Saved his life and turned him back towards faith.
Because then he was intentional about finding the survivors, those children who had then grown up, and meeting them. And you tell the heart-wrenching stories when he meets the mother of 3 of them who were saved there by those people. I mean, I cried my way through that chapter, I have to say. It's very...
It's wonderful. Because W.H. Auden, it was evil. And this is goodness.
Yeah.
Or G.K. Chesterton stopped in his tracks by a dandelion. I love that one too. A little beautiful little weed. That's what made him think in his journey.
So it can be the beautiful works of art of a church in Florence, or it can be a dandelion, or it can be a cheetah, or it can be so many, or love in the case of your grandparents, or it can be big things like joy or love, or it can be little things like a dandelion. And I think I love the inquisitive spirit that you are calling each one of us to cultivate, because outside of that, I mean, the inquisitive spirit is what's going to take us outside of our very comfortable air-conditioned caves, right?
No, that's right. I mean, philosophers say that the beginning of philosophy is wonder, curiosity. You start asking questions. But if you think, most of us know that when we're kids, we asked all sorts of, why this, why that? And our parents sort of shut us up after a while. They haven't time to answer all the crazy questions we have. And so becoming an adult is actually a period when we have fewer and fewer questions. And that's tragic. We should be open to the wonder, the curiosity, and the questions of life. So we're always thinking, always caring. I love that. That's Socrates' great statement. The unexamined life is not worth living. We've got to have the courage to keep asking questions.
And asking the Lord to allow us to enter what your fellow countrymen, the Irish, call the thin places, so that we can experience those thin places. Tell us about the thin places as we're wrapping up.
Well, that's the Irish expression for showing how, this world we take a solid reality, the seen world, you can touch, taste, weigh, and so on. Actually, it's a very thin place towards something mysterious, supernatural beyond it. And the Irish have a great sense of that, which I love. I'm Irish too. So I love that. But many modern people, G.K. Chesterton put it bluntly, many modern people are like a middle-aged businessman after a heavy lunch. In other words, they're half asleep. And that's tragic. We're not awake and open to the questions and wonders of life.
Yes. I think this is a powerful challenge for every generation, but especially for this coming generation.
And now, a brief message from Gospel Spice.
Did you know that Gospel Spice has a library of in-depth Bible studies available online for free? Discover our previous podcast studies on your own or with friends, and enjoy exclusive content that includes listening guides for each teaching episode, study questions, verses to memorize, tips, and more. Just visit gospelspice.com and click on the Studies tab. Now back to the podcast.
Now, back to the video.
Oz, what is one book outside of The Call? You mentioned The Call, so you can't repeat that one. What is one book you've written that you would encourage someone who doesn't know you, maybe a younger Christian who hasn't met you or heard of you? What's one book that you would recommend they read?
Oh, gosh. I think books are for particular people at particular times. But one of my other books, which I absolutely love, is Carpe Diem.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's not about calling, it's about seizing the moment, a sense of time.
Mm-hmm.
Americans have a very heavy sense of space, but Americans don't seem to have a very good sense of time. And that's one of the constant emphases in the Bible, as I mentioned earlier, discerning the times and so on. So Carpe Diem is one of my favorite books, and I know it's meant a lot to many people, second only perhaps to The Call.
Okay.
Not hoping that these two will overtake Carpe Diem and rival The Call, but we'll see.
Mm-hmm. That would be great. Yeah. So that's at least 4 books to start with: The Great Quest, Signals of Transcendence, Carpe Diem, and The Call. So that's a good place to get started, right?
Yes.
I'm going to read the last few lines that you repeat in each chapter. And then would you mind praying for our audience as we close? I'm going to read that if that's all right. Remember again that each signal of transcendence sounds out its own special call. No signal is a signal for everyone to hear. So not one person's signal is another person's silence. Be ready then for the call that comes to you in your life. Whoever has ears to hear, let him hear. Mm-hmm. And you really have to read this, everyone who's listening and watching this right now. Oz, would you like to pray for those who are watching and listening for us?
Well, let me pray along the lines of the great prayer of St. Augustine. Lord, you have made us for yourself, and our hearts are restless until they find their rest in you. Mm. Lord, we thank you that you are the fulfillment of all our questions, the fulfillment of all our aspirations. And we pray that we will never be satisfied until we discover in you all that you want us to know and to experience. So grant that everyone who hears this podcast may be people who think and search and seek everything you want to show them. And then we know they will find. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. Yes, because when we don't know where he is, he does reveal himself and show us, as your wife was praying as well. So thank you, Oz, so much. It is always such a joy and a privilege, and I wish I could tell everyone to really spend so much time with you through your books, because there's so much wisdom. I have barely scratched the surface of all the wisdom that God is giving us through you. So I hope many, many, many more people will do that. Thank you.
Thank you. Great to be with you again. Hello, this is Os Guinness. I've just been on the Gospel Spice podcast with Stephanie, which is a tremendous joy. What I love about it is that as a good French woman, She has an incredible sense of all the Epicurean joys of life and taste and sound and so on, and brings those to an understanding of what our faith is. So there's nothing stale and everything exciting and delicious about what she's arguing for. So a great privilege to be on.
Thank you so much for watching today's episode. Merci. Please be sure to subscribe to our channel and click that bell icon so you are the first to know when we release a new video or episode. Also, would you please consider helping us reach new people with the good news of the spice of the gospel by leaving a 5-star review for the Gospel Spice podcast on listening platforms like Spotify, iTunes, Google, etc. Finally, share and follow us on social media to spread the word of Gospel Spice. Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to tune in our podcast with new episodes every Friday. I'll see you in our next video very soon, right here. Merci.